Hello again. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm extremely excited to introduce our next guest speaker, Dr. Lande Ajose. Dr. Ajose is a local and state leader navigating the current changes in our economy, workforce, and communities. Now, more than ever, it is important to understand the economic, demographic, and political trends expected in our future. Dr. Ajose is Vice President and Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair in Understanding California's Future, and a Senior Fellow at Public Policy Institute of California. Her career has focused on improving the lives of Californians by working in state government, private philanthropy, and research institutions. Today, Dr. Ajose will share the latest research and data explore how cities can use available data and resources to promote opportunity, equity, and sustainability in every Californian community. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Ajose.
Good morning. Can I tell you how fun it is to have your own walk-up music? I mean, come on. My kids would be like, Mom, you got your own walk-up music? Anyway, thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you for having me. I want to first start by thanking the tremendous staff at Cal Cities. You guys have been amazing. Thank you so much for all the work you've done to put into this conference. Thank you to Ali, thank you to Mayor Villaraigosa. He actually set up my presentation here very well. I am delighted to be here with you today to talk with you a little bit about what I do and how we at the Public Policy Institute of California are thinking about issues related to the future of California. And so I thought I'd start with this iconic photograph. Behold California, colossus of the West Coast. The most populous American state, the world's 5th largest economy, and arguably the most culturally influential, exporting Google searches, Instagram feeds, iPhones, Teslas, Netflix originals, and of course, kimchi quesadillas. This place inspires awe. If I close my eyes, I can see silhouettes of Joshua trees against the desert sunrise, seals playing in La Jolla's craggy coves of sun-spangled emerald seawater, fog rolling over a rugged Sonoma County coast at sunset into primeval groves of redwoods that John Steinbeck called ambassadors of another time. That I just read to you is a quote from The Atlantic last summer. Despite this florid description of our beloved state, the title for that article was "The California Dream is Dying." And the piece goes on to offer a scathing critique of all the ways in which California is crumbling before us. As it turns out, that beautiful, florid description of our state was the only complimentary thing in the entire article. In fact, most of the articles that cover the state of California look a little bit more like this. Here's Dan Walters. He writes for Cal Matters, and he said, "To be certain, there's much to dislike about California today, including the nation's highest level of homelessness, its highest level of poverty, its extreme economic disparity, its water supply crisis, its epidemic of wildfires, and its crime spike, and of course, its extremely high cost of living." Capital Weekly says California faces many challenges now. One is the climate emergency, another is economic recovery, add COVID-19 positivity, This is a partial list. You get the picture. Big major news outlets like Newsweek are also talking about California. They say that while we used to be the essence of the national dream, today its leaders are increasingly seeing it as a post-America with its own racial, gender, and environmental standards. We are known for the nation's worst homeless crisis and rising crime. What does it say? A ride on Highway 33 through the impoverished expanses of the Central Valley reveals a vast and bleak landscape of abandoned cars, dilapidated houses, and threadbare shops. The pandemic has accelerated California's class divide, vastly enriching the tech elite and financing oligarchs, but leaving California with the nation's highest unemployment rate and making it the second hardest place to find a job. Now, when I decided to come to PPIC, I took this job because I am a believer in the state of California. I believe in our promise. I believe in our diversity. I believe in our economic ability to reshape not only this state, but this nation. And yet, I admit we have deep challenges that we need to take on, that we need to solve. And so what I want to talk to you about now is how we're thinking about doing that and contributing to that work at the Public Policy Institute of California. I came because I have a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that the future of California is largely dependent on this state continuing to attract and retain a diverse pool of talent. That Californians must be deeply, deeply concerned about issues related to quality of life and cost of living. That is what we have to solve. And there are several attendant challenges that are going to get in the way of us solving the quality of life and the cost of living problem. What we do at PPIC is we dig into the data to understand exactly what the pathway can be from here to there. My program area is called Understanding California's Future. We have a goal, which is to take on long-term challenges and figure out what are the solutions to those long-term challenges in this state. The way in which we do it, we analyze demographic, economic, environmental, and political trends. And we try to figure out if the trend line continues, given what we know, what does that mean for the future of the state? If we think that that trend line is positive, how can we accelerate it? And if we think that that trend line is negative, what are the mitigating policies that we can propose so that we can get on a better track? You see here at the bottom of the slide, there are lots of types of data that we want to look at to try and get a better sense of where we're going. Demographic data that has to do with population change, migration issues, economic data that looks not only at employment, but business starts, especially small businesses. That's the engine of this state. Political data that looks at voting rates, political participation, issues related to political polarization, and of course, environmental issues, air quality, extreme heat, wildfires, floods, but also what are some of the solutions? How do we think about things like electronic vehicles as being a part of the solution to addressing our climate crisis? So those are the kinds of issues that we'll be taking on. And what I want to share with you today are what we know about two of those issues. We've really been focusing for the last year or so on the demographic trends, right? And what we know about demographic trends and on some of the economic trends. And what we'll be building out over the next 18 to 24 months is our knowledge and our understanding of some of the housing trends, some of the climate trends. And so I want to talk you through some of those things as we think about what portends a future for the state of California. So let's start with the demography. California is a big state, everybody knows that. If you look at this, it looks like we're about 40 million strong. But what you see is this very little dip right at the end of that slide. What does that mean? That little dip means a lot. Here's what that little dip looks like if you zoom in to 30 years rather than the 100 years on the previous slide. What it means is that California has a much more undulating trend in terms of our population, and that in the last several years, since 2012, we have been losing population in terms of the number of people who are coming to the state as a result of the pandemic. And you see in the pandemic years, huge drop-off. People assume that that huge drop-off is because Elon Musk moved to Texas. Not so. The reason that our population is declining has to do with a number of factors, a confluence of factors that have all come together in the last several years. First of all, we know that birth rates over the last 10 years or so have been steadily declining from what we saw as a height of about 510,000 in 2010, 2011 to roughly 420,000 in 2021. At the same time, death rates have been increasing, and you see this sharp uptick during the years of the pandemic, so that we went from an average of roughly 250,000 to 350,000 in a couple of years. At the same time, we've had changes in our federal migration policy, such that the number of people coming to the state of California in terms of recent immigrants is falling off, is sloping off. And then at the very bottom, you see that the net in-state migration is really jagged and just dropping off very, very dramatically. So internationally, we have fewer people coming, and then within, people who are in the state of California, they are leaving California pretty remarkably. Not everyone is leaving, though. It's really, there's some differences in terms of who we know is staying in the state and who we know is leaving. In terms of interstate migration, this shows net interstate migration. And what this means is that of the number of people who came and left, the net number of people in 2010 to 2015, the net was a loss in terms of people with less than a bachelor's degree, but a slight increase in terms of people with a bachelor's degree or more. So we lost a net of 400,000 and we gained about 100,000. In the last 4 years, 4 to 5 years, however, we lost even more, 472,000, and we are barely hanging on in terms of people with a bachelor's degree. 2,000 people in the last 4 years. That actually explains a lot about California having lost a congressional seat in terms of what is happening with our population. Similarly, if you look at the distribution by income, you'll see that we are losing many more people who have less income, and we are not gaining the number of people who have higher incomes. In fact, in that very last slide, 2016 to 2020, you can see there's actually a net loss in terms of people with higher income. That's Elon Musk, just so you know. All of that exists across the cross currents of what's been happening in terms of the demography of our population. We have been changing in terms of race and ethnicity in this state. You'll see that California is now what we call a majority-minority state, if you will, whereas in 1970s, whites were 78% of the population. Today, they are 35%. The largest ethnic population in this state was Latinos at 39%. And you can see that 35% of whites versus everyone else, right, 65%, we are a majority-minority state. And the question really becomes for this majority-minority state, are the economic benefits evenly distributed? Do they look like the population, or are they different? Because if they don't look like the population, that leads to lots of other distress that we know that can occur in terms of civic engagement, in terms of polarization, in terms of civil society. So those were our demographic trends. I also want to talk about the economic trends because they're equally important. We want to take on a lot of work within understanding California's future to understand how this state not only works as a state, but by regions, because we know that our regions are very, very different. Case in point, let's look at per capita income. I live in Oakland. You see the Bay Area. Our per capita income is extremely high. It's really leading the state It's not really due to anything happening in Oakland. It all has to do with what's happening in the Silly Valley, as I like to call it. On the other hand, what you see is that we have some regions, that have been gradually declining in terms of per capita income, particularly the Inland Empire and the San Joaquin Valley. That's really important when we think about, again, population change and who lives in different regions of this state. There are places in this state where we know the individuals who live there are earning less, are Black and Latino and underrepresented groups, and then other parts of the state which are whiter and have more income. We need to think about that in terms of the fraying of our civil society. To really understand how California's per capita income plays out, it's helpful to understand what it would look like compared to other states. And what we see here is the Inland Empire and the San Joaquin Valley. They look a whole lot like Alabama and Arkansas in terms of thinking about per capita income. Whereas Orange County looks a lot more like Massachusetts. And where I live, the San Francisco Bay Area, it doesn't even compare. Connecticut, which has the highest, we far outstrip Connecticut by over $25,000 on a per capita basis. That's how ridiculous it is to live in the Bay Area. We saw some changes that took place during the pandemic in terms of the economy, and particularly in terms of jobs. We saw that the job losses were greatest amongst those who were less educated. That might also explain why we have many more of those folks who are leaving the state because of those job losses. So you'll see here that during the Great Recession, we lost 5.7 million jobs for those with a bachelor's degree. During the pandemic recession, almost three times that? Almost 3 times that, 16 million jobs. Compared with bachelor's degree, we lost 1.2 million jobs. During the recession, we lost 3.9 million jobs. So much more gradual. Again, those folks who have less than a bachelor's degree are struggling significantly in the state of California. Having said that, the shape of this past recession, and I remember there was a lot of conversations like, what would the shape of the recession be? Would it be a V-shaped recession, a W-shaped recession? The shape of the pandemic recession was in fact a V. We had a pretty significant bounce back. It looked really different from what we know to be other recessions in the state of California. The dot-com recession was quite gradual. The Great Recession was deep, and it took us a while to get out of it. Shows here about 7 years. It only took us, we're not quite there, but 2 years to recover from the pandemic recession. And so that says something about people having some belief in this state being able to recover and who can find work. What we were really encouraged to see is that even with all of that change, even with all that economic dislocation, that the recovery is actually much more equitable than we anticipated it might be. So unemployment rates have actually declined in terms of the decrease between groups. It's also declined in terms of the regional variation. And the wages seem to have grown the most in the low-wage sectors of the economy, which means for those people who are struggling, for those people who earn the least, that they are actually finding it maybe a little bit easier, at least until inflation really hit, they were finding it a little bit easier to make do in the state. My expertise actually is in education, so I had to throw in one education slide, and it's just to say this, that even though we have seen a more equitable recovery through the pandemic, what we also know is that California has a lot of room for improvement in terms of what's happening in K-12 and in higher ed. Of 1,000, on average of 1,000 ninth graders, we can only expect about 305 to complete a bachelor's degree. Only a third. And actually very few of them, we only expect about 800 of them, 4 out of 5, to even complete high school. So we have a very, very porous educational system when it comes to high school and college. And if we really want to invest in our economy, if we want to retain talent, we have to be thinking about this pipeline and what is happening in terms of education and our ability to ensure that every student completes high school and has the opportunity for college and can complete either a 4-year degree or a 2-year credential if that's what they choose to do. The pandemic has meant a lot of changes for us, a lot of changes for the state of California and how we work. One of the most significant is this shift to remote work. And what we know is that remote work has a lot of benefits. It also has some drawbacks, and I think a lot of companies are really trying to figure out, what does it mean? Should we have a hybrid work situation? Should we require people to come to the office, maybe just on certain days? Does everyone get to work from home? Do we give people who work from home a stipend so that they can go to a co-working space? All of those things are now being currently tested. But what we have seen is that remote work is a winning strategy if you're an employer and you're trying to attract talent. That many of the people who are entering the workforce or who are looking for new jobs are looking for choice. And that has a lot to do with how people will experience work. We learned a lot during the pandemic about those people who had no choices and how that felt in terms of their exposure to COVID-19. And we want to make sure that, again, we are not doing things that are polarizing our society any more than it currently is, because we're trying to actually ameliorate that. You can see that depending on which sector you're in, the opportunity to work remotely shifts pretty dramatically. And that we have some sectors, IT, finance, even some of the professional executives, they tend to have a lot of opportunity to be at home, whereas people who are fully in person, there are healthcare workers, there are retail workers, there are service workers, manufacturing. So we're thinking about, what does all this mean? How do we think about the opportunities in terms of economic growth, in terms of economic stability? We need to really think about, how do we keep people in the labor market? We need to think about what are the supports that people need to be in the labor market, especially when it comes to caring for older adults, parents who are ailing, children. We also need to think about the wages that people are able to earn, and some of the new factors like remote work, like new technologies, like AI, that will continue to shift the employment landscape for the state of California. There also will need to continue to be a social safety net. We saw the importance of that social safety net during the pandemic, when people were out of work and needed to be able to rely on unemployment insurance and other kinds of insurance, and we know that we need to have that in place in the event of any kind of emergency or crisis. So that is the economic and the demographic change that we're going to be tracking, and we have, as you saw from that illustrative slide, many more trends that we'll be looking at. Now I want to give you a little peek into what's to come. We don't have as much data here yet because we're still framing this out, but we want to make sure that we are taking stock of some of the political trends in this state. You can't think about political trends until you understand who's able to engage and participate. So it's important to understand the age of our population. What you'll see is that the vast majority of Californians are over the age of 19 and are able to vote. So we have a lot of folks who can vote. We also know that Californians are increasingly more diverse the younger that they are. And so that means that as we're thinking about the future of California and thinking about who our voters will be, we need to be paying attention to those kinds of dynamic shifts. California's diversity, however, currently is not fully represented in terms of who votes. We see here that in terms of likely voters, more than half of likely voters are white, compared with only about 20% who are Latino. Very small percentage are African American, and a smaller percentage also, relatively speaking, are Asian. Compared with those who are not registered to vote, you see that Latinos are most likely to not be registered to vote for a number of reasons, followed then by Asian Americans and then by whites. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about what does it mean to engage in the political process in a formal way. There are also informal ways to engage in terms of civic participation, but understanding California's diversity and what that means for voting habits and patterns and what that means for our elected officials will be a significant part of our work. So moving forward, we want to take demographic, economic, political, and environmental trends, spin them out to understand what's happening over time and understand those issues in context. And what I have the opportunity to do is to think about two issues that I think are most significant in terms of how we think about the state of California. And those two issues are housing and climate change. In terms of housing, we're going to look at doing three things. One is we want to look at a lot of these trends, some of the population trends in terms of who is in a home, who is not in a home, who rents, who is being evicted. How do we understand the relationship between who in the population has access to different types of housing and what that means in terms of their engagement, both in their community and in the workforce. We want to be able to understand how Californians are thinking about policy solutions that our electeds are putting forward when it comes to housing trends. And then we want to make sure that the public has access to data, that you all, as decision makers and as leaders in your communities, have access to data. We're going to increasingly try to provide that data, not just at the statewide level, but also at the regional level, and in some cases at a city level, so that people can make decisions based on the data that we see. An example of some of that data is looking at home ownership rates. I would direct you to the green line and the yellow line in particular. If you think about those aged 35 to 39, in 1980, roughly 62% of them were able to owned a home. Today, in 2020, 44%. The rates of home ownership in this state are declining. And that has serious implications for how people decide that they're going to engage in their cities and in their regions. We also see that home ownership and equity are not evenly distributed in this state. So in this slide, you'll see that people with high equity in their homes are largely white and Asian Pacific Islander, whereas people who are renters tend largely to be African American, Asian American, Native American. That also has implications for our cities. And in terms of the equity piece, I think it's important to note that people have always turned to home ownership as the means to create wealth, to close the wealth gap. And if we have this kind of distribution in our home ownership, and especially in terms of being a high equity owner, and we know what the trends are in terms of younger Californians and the diversity of this state, what does that mean? And what does it mean that we know that people aren't buying homes at similar rates? So we're going to try and make sense of all of these various pieces of data together. Climate change is the new issue area for us. We have for long had a very, very robust policy area focused on water policy. We're really trying to expand that and to think about the ways in which climate change in particular are going to reshape this state. It's already started. We want to think about both what some of the emerging opportunities are, both economically and in terms of employment. What do we know about innovation? What do we know about new businesses? What do we know about new opportunities for work? How do we think about the relationship between housing and sustainability? A lot of people will tell you, well, we need to build more housing. Where do we need to build that housing? Who wants different types of housing? We need to be paying attention to all of those dynamics together and not presuming that even though logically it might look as if a particular housing solution may make sense, we need to make sure that that actually also aligns with public opinion and where people actually want to live. And then we also need to track that public opinion and test with the public what they think about the various solutions that our policymakers are coming up with to address the climate crisis. On this slide, we wanted to get a sense of where people are thinking their views are in terms of when climate change is starting to happen. And what's interesting, and what you'll see is, over the course of the last 10 years, many more people believe, 60 to 69%, believe that climate change has already begun. So whereas it used to be a proposition that was out there in the future, today, climate change is here. You have many, and it's interesting to also look at the don't know, because in 2022, everyone feels like they have a sense of what the answer is in terms of whether or not climate change has started. Is climate change a threat to the quality of life in California? You will find here that there is an increasing sense amongst Californians that climate change is in fact a threat to quality of life in California and to the economy. Having said that, we are finding a really interesting trend, and that is, even though most people favor laws that will help us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, amongst those who don't know, that has reduced significantly since 2017. And it hasn't reduced in the area of people thinking, yes, I want the state to do something. People are worried. People are growing in their concern about how we are addressing climate change and what the transition from the existing economy to a climate economy means, what it means for jobs, what it means for particular regions, and we have to pay attention to that. Here we ask the question specifically about jobs. Do you think that doing things to reduce climate change in the future would cause there to be more jobs, fewer jobs for people around the state? And what you see is in the last couple of years, people don't think that climate change is going to cause more jobs. They think it's going to result in fewer jobs. People are concerned that the actual process of shifting from the current economy to a climate sustainable economy is actually going to cause a lot of economic distress. When it comes to efforts to fight climate change, should California be a leader? Surprisingly, we have more people who think that California maybe should not be a leader in the climate crisis. While in 2017, 58% said it was very important, today only 41% think it's very important. I think people are concerned that we are doing work that is about the nation and not work that is about the actual transition and how it affects people in our state. And here we ask people if they favor or oppose government making its own policies separate from the federal government to address climate change. And while you see that people, generally speaking, do favor it, we are seeing that, again, people are becoming much more certain about what they think the answer is. We don't have that many don't knows anymore. People are making a choice between I either favor it or I oppose it. So what does all this mean? What does all this data mean for you? Do people think government should do something? Absolutely. Almost 60% of Californians think that government has a role in solving the kinds of crises that we see in this state: housing, climate change, the economy. How you think, or the strength with which you think people should be addressing that the government should be addressing that, does vary by some of these demographics. So you'll see African Americans, those earning less than $40,000, those who are Asian American, they believe strongly that there is a role for government. There's also a fairly significant partisan divide as we think about what the role of government should be. There are two ways to be thinking about that. Some people think that, those who prefer to pay higher taxes and have the government provide more services. You see 74% of Democrats and 47% of independents. But those who think that the state should do more to reduce the gap between rich and poor, 80% of Democrats, 49% of independents. What's interesting here is that the Republicans are very consistent in their beliefs on things. With that said, there's a lot to look forward to. What we are in right now is an extraordinary time for the state of California. The level of federal investment that we have seen, both as a result of the pandemic and now because of the federal acts that we have seen, is an enormous opportunity. You heard Mayor Villaraigosa say that the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, it's going to bring $10 billion in transportation funding alone, $14 billion anticipated to come to the state of California. That's a once-in-a-lifetime investment that we cannot afford to squander. We stand to receive roughly $21 billion from the most recent, Inflation Reduction Act. The distribution of those funds still to be determined. The question for this state, the question for all of you is, how do we make use of those dollars not only to address significant issues today, but to be thinking about this investment paying off next year and in 10 years and in 20 years and in 30 years. I would posit that the way to do that is that we expect a lot from our cities, and it's really clear to me that our cities can't solve problems that are not city-based problems. Pothole, city-based problem. Climate change, not a city-based problem. Homelessness, not a city-based problem. Housing, not a city-based problem. And we know this because we know that people are driving miles and miles in their search for more affordable housing. We know this because we know that the effects of climate change, when there is a wildfire that's 300 miles away, I'm seeing the ash in my hometown. So we need to make sure that our state government and our federal government are assuming their due responsibility, but we also need to make sure that we are operating as regions that are thinking more holistically and more comprehensively about what we need to do together. It is not just about cities doing what they can. It is about cities working with other cities. It's about cities working with counties. It's about regions coming together so that we can solve what is a regional housing crisis, so that we can address what are regional economic issues. So my charge to you would be to think about, yes, there are things that my city, my town can take care of, can address, but if we really want impact, if we really want to make a difference, then we need to think about the broader regions in which we live and how we can come together with our partners in other places to solve the most intractable problems so that the California that we end up with is the California that most people don't think exists, but we all know exists. It's the California in that picture. It's the California full of promise. It's the California that's at the leading edge of creating the world's economy. That is the California that we all believe in. That is the California that you all are responsible for, and I know that you will be able to help the state and the nation solve those problems. Thank you.